The Knock at 3 a.m. A Horror Story Part 1. The new house nobody tells you about. The silence when you move into a new house. Not the comfortable kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone has gone to bed and the world outside has decided to hold its breath for the night. No, this was a different kind of silence altogether. The kind that presses against your eardrums like two cold palms cupped over the sides of your head. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of every creak in the floorboards, every drip from a faucet you forgot to tighten, every shallow breath that passes your own lips. Marcus Hale noticed it on the very first night. He stood in the center of the living room of the house on Fenwick Road, surrounded by towers of cardboard boxes that he had not yet unpacked, holding a mug of chamomile tea he had brewed more out of habit than any real desire for warmth. The movers had left hours ago. His wife, Dana, had kissed him on the cheek, reminded him that she and their daughter, Lily, would be joining him in 3 days once the school week wrapped up, and then driven away in the silver station wagon that still had Lily's crayon drawings stuck to the rear window with suction cups. Marcus was alone. He had insisted on moving in first, alone, so that he could get the house in order before his family arrived. It had seemed like a logical and generous idea at the time. He was a methodical man by nature. He liked to organize things, to arrange a space to his satisfaction before others moved through it. He was an architect by trade, and there was something deeply satisfying to him about setting a room right, about understanding the geometry of a space before it became lived in. But standing there in the dark living room of the house on Fenwick Road, with the boxes looming around him and the silence pressing in from all directions, Marcus felt the first cold tremor of something he did not yet have a name for. He told himself it was just the strangeness of a new place. He told himself that every house had its own rhythm, and that it took time to learn it. He told himself these things in the calm, rational voice he used with clients when they were anxious about a design that had not yet come together on paper. He did not entirely believe himself, but it was enough to carry him upstairs to the master bedroom, where he had set up the air mattress earlier in the day. He lay down on top of the sleeping bag, stared at the unfamiliar ceiling, and eventually fell into a shallow and unrestful sleep. He woke at exactly 3 in the morning. He knew the time because his phone was on the floor beside the air mattress, face up, and the green numbers on its screen read 300 a.m. with a precision that struck him, in his half-dreaming state, as almost deliberate, as though the time itself had been arranged. He lay still for a moment, trying to identify what had pulled him out of sleep. He was a light sleeper by nature, a trait that Dana had always found both endearing and mildly infuriating. A garbage truck 2 streets over could wake him. A dog barking in a neighboring yard could do it. The distant sound of a car alarm could drag him up from the deepest REM cycle like a hook through water. But the house was silent, completely, utterly, absolutely silent. And then he heard it. 3 knocks on the front door. Slow, measured, deliberate, not the frantic hammering of someone in distress, not the cheerful double tap of a neighbor bearing a welcome casserole. 3 distinct, unhurried knocks, each one separated from the next by exactly the same interval of time, as though whoever stood on the other side of that door was counting the beats between them. 1, 2, 3. Marcus sat up. His heart had gone from the slow, oceanic pulse of a man asleep to the rapid staccato of a man who is afraid, and it had made that journey in approximately 2 seconds. He sat in the dark of the bedroom, the air mattress softly hissing beneath him as it redistributed his weight, and he listened. Nothing. The silence returned like a held breath, thick and expectant and somehow worse than the knocking had been, because the knocking had at least been something he could identify. A sound had a source. Silence had none. He picked up his phone and checked the time again. 3:01 a.m. He pulled up Dana's number and almost called her, then stopped himself. It was 3 in the morning. She was asleep. He would feel ridiculous telling her he had been frightened by someone knocking on his door. He went downstairs. He turned on every light in the front hallway as he descended, and the yellow glow of the overhead fixture pushed back the dark in a way that was deeply reassuring. He walked to the front door, which had a small rectangular window of frosted glass set into it at eye level, and he looked through it. The porch was empty. He could see the 2 wooden steps leading down to the front path, and the path itself curving away toward the street, and the street itself gleaming faintly under the amber wash of the streetlight on the corner. He could see the hedge that ran along the property line, dark and still. He could see the neighbor's house across the road, its windows dark, its residents sensibly asleep. There was no one there. Marcus stood at the door for a long moment, his hand resting on the deadbolt, then slowly exhaled. A prank, he decided. Kids in the neighborhood, testing the new arrival, or perhaps not even that. Perhaps he had dreamed the sound, and the act of dreaming it had woken him. The brain did strange things in new environments. He knew that. He went back to bed. He did not sleep again until nearly 6 in the morning, and when he did, his dreams were dark and formless and full of a sound he could not quite identify. A rhythmic sound, patient and slow, like someone counting. Part 2. The pattern had happened again the following night. Marcus had spent the day unpacking boxes, assembling furniture, familiarizing himself with the layout of the house with the methodical thoroughness of a man who mapped spaces for a living. He walked every room. He measured doorways with his eyes. He identified the places where the afternoon light came in at the best angles and noted where he might suggest to Dana that they rearrange what they had planned. He found in the process that the house was a good house. Solid bones, well-proportioned rooms, a kitchen that faced east, which was exactly right for morning light. He found also that the basement door stuck. It was a small thing. Old houses had doors that stuck. Humidity warped the frames over the years, and the wood swelled and settled in ways that required a firm shoulder to persuade. He noted it without particular concern and moved on. But later that evening, as he sat on the floor of the living room eating takeout from a container and scrolling through his phone, he found himself thinking about the basement door, about the way it had resisted, about the particular quality of that resistance, which had felt, in a way he could not entirely articulate, less like the passive swelling of wood and more like something actively pushing back from the other side. He told himself he was being absurd. He went to bed at 11, which was later than he had intended, and he fell asleep more quickly than the previous night, which he took as a good sign. His body was adapting. He was finding the rhythm of the new house. He woke at exactly 3 in the morning. He knew before he was fully conscious that it was coming. He felt it in the way a person feels the approach of a thunderstorm before the first clouds appear on the horizon, a pressure in the air, a shift in the quality of the darkness. He lay on the air mattress and stared at the ceiling and waited, and his waiting had the awful, helpless quality of a man watching a car that he knows is going to crash. 3 knocks, slow, measured, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. He was downstairs in 40 seconds. He had his phone in his hand with the flashlight application already running, casting a white cone of light ahead of him as he descended. He had his keys in the other hand, the way he might if he intended to get into his car and drive somewhere, although he did not consciously decide to do that. He looked through the frosted glass in the front door. Empty porch, empty path, empty street. The hedge, The streetlight, the dark windows of the house across the road. He threw open the front door. Cold night air moved past him into the hallway. He stepped out onto the porch, the boards cold under his bare feet, and looked in both directions along the path, and then out to the street. He walked down the 2 steps to the front path and looked up and down the road. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Not even a dog. He was about to turn back when the flashlight on his phone illuminated something he had not noticed from the doorway. There, in the thin layer of dew that had formed on the wooden boards of the porch, were 2 wet footprints. They faced the door. They were roughly the size and shape of adult feet, bare, with 5 toes clearly visible. They did not lead to the porch from the steps. They simply were there, facing the door, as though whoever had made them had appeared on the porch from nowhere and then vanished again, leaving only the wet impression of their feet to confirm that they had ever existed at all. Marcus took a photograph of the footprints with his phone. Then he went inside, locked every lock in the house, pushed a kitchen chair under the handle of the basement door, and did not sleep again. Part 3. Dana. He did not tell Dana about the knocking. She arrived on Friday afternoon with Lily, and the station wagon full of the things that turned a house into a home. The framed photographs and the particular throw blanket from the sofa, and the small collection of plants on the kitchen windowsill that Dana treated with a care bordering on devotion. Lily ran through every room making sounds of assessment, her small feet thundering up and down the stairs, her voice rising and falling with the particular enthusiasm of a 7-year-old discovering the dimensions of a new territory. And Marcus watched them move through the house and felt something loosen in his chest that he had not realized was tight. They had dinner together at the kitchen table, a proper dinner cooked on the stove rather than eaten from a container, and Lily told them about something that had happened at school involving a boy named Felix and a misunderstanding about whose turn it was on the classroom computer. Dana laughed. Marcus laughed. The kitchen was warm and bright. That night, with Dana sleeping beside him on the bed they had finally assembled and made up with the familiar sheets that smelled of their own laundry detergent, Marcus lay awake and watched the ceiling and waited. 2:59 a.m., 3 a.m., 3:01 a.m. Nothing. The silence was the regular, comfortable silence of a house at rest, not the pressurized, expectant silence of the previous 2 nights. Marcus exhaled slowly and let himself relax into the mattress and felt, for the first time since he had moved in, genuinely at ease. He slept deeply and dreamlessly until morning. Nothing happened on Saturday night either, and by Sunday, Marcus had begun to revise the story he was telling himself about the events of the first 2 nights. He had been stressed. The move had been a significant undertaking. He was in a new environment. The brain, deprived of familiar sensory landmarks, sometimes manufactured experience to fill the void. The knocking had very likely been the sound of the old house contracting in the cold night air, amplified by the acoustics of the empty rooms and distorted by the particular dream state he had been in at the time. The footprints were harder to explain away. He looked at the photograph on his phone several times over the weekend, studying the wet impressions on the wooden porch boards. They were undeniably there. They were undeniably foot-shaped, but he had been tired and frightened in the moment of taking the photograph, and he supposed it was possible that his perception had been distorted, that he had seen pattern in randomness, the way the human eye always seeks out faces in clouds and meaning in coincidence. He deleted the photograph on Sunday evening. On Sunday night, Dana woke him with a hand on his shoulder. He surfaced from sleep to find her sitting up beside him in the dark, her face turned toward the bedroom door, her expression not quite afraid but sharply alert in the way of someone who has heard something that does not fit. "Did you hear that?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a murmur. Marcus was already hearing it. 3 knocks on the front door. Slow, measured, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. He checked his phone. 3 a.m. Part 4. What the neighbor knew his name was Gerald Oates, and he lived directly across the street in the white house with the dark shutters. And he was 73 years old, and had lived on Fenwick Road for 41 years, and consequently knew a great deal about the history of every house on the block. Marcus knocked on his door on Monday morning. Gerald answered in the slow, unhurried way of a man who has nowhere particular to be and has made his peace with that. He was a tall man, lean in the way that some men become lean in old age, his face a topographic map of decades spent largely outdoors. He wore a cardigan the color of old mustard and regarded Marcus with the calm, appraising look of someone who has been watching the new family settle into the house across the road and has been waiting without particular impatience for exactly this visit. "Come in," he said. "I wondered when you would come." Marcus sat at Gerald's kitchen table and accepted a cup of coffee he did not want and said, as directly as he knew how, "We have been hearing knocking on our front door at 3 in the morning. When we check, there is no one there." Gerald said nothing for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in a slow circle on the table, studying the motion, and then he looked up at Marcus with an expression that was not surprise and not confirmation and was something in between. "How many knocks?" he asked. 3, Marcus said. Gerald nodded as though this was precisely what he had expected to hear. "The family before you had the same experience," he said, "and the family before them. It has been the same since at least the 1980s, which is as far back as I have direct knowledge, although I suspect it goes further." Marcus set down his coffee mug. "What is it?" he asked. Gerald looked out the window at the house on the other side of the road. He looked at it for a long time before he answered. "There was a man who lived in that house a long time ago," he said finally, "before my time here. The neighbors who were here when I arrived told me about him. His name was Edmund Farrow. He was a reclusive man by all accounts. He lived alone for most of his adult life, and he was not, by any measurement I have heard, a well man, not physically, not otherwise." Gerald paused. "He died in that house," he continued, "alone. His body was not found for some time. The neighbors said there had been 3 days of knocking at his door before anyone finally went to check. His postman. 3 mornings in a row, the postman knocked at 3 in the afternoon, which he always did if there was a package. Edmund never answered. On the 3rd day, the postman called the authorities." Marcus felt the cold move through him in a slow wave, beginning somewhere at the base of his spine. 3 knocks, he said. Gerald turned from the window and looked at him. "The neighbors who told me the story believed that Edmund was still knocking," he said simply. "That he was waiting for someone to come and check. That he had been waiting for a very long time." Marcus drove home in the gray Monday morning light and sat in his parked car in the driveway for a long time before he went inside. Part 5. Lily was the first to hear it inside the house. It was Tuesday night. Marcus and Dana had agreed in the careful, measured way of 2 rational adults who are both quietly terrified to document the occurrences. They had set up Marcus's old digital camera on a tripod in the front hallway, aimed at the door. They had agreed that when the knocking came, they would go down together, both of them, and they would look through the door and then they would open it, and they would do this systematically, and without allowing panic to override reason. They fell asleep at 11. At 2:47 a.m., Lily appeared in the doorway of the master bedroom. She was wearing her yellow pajamas with the small stars on them. She was holding her stuffed rabbit, the one she had owned since infancy and which was worn smooth in the places she held it most often. Her face in the darkness was perfectly calm in the way that children's faces can sometimes be calm in the middle of the night, undefended, unguarded, simply open. "There is someone outside my window," she said. "He wants to come in." Dana was out of bed before Marcus had fully processed the words. She crossed the room and crouched in front of Lily and took her daughter's face in her hands. "Did you see someone, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice carrying the particular controlled steadiness of a mother who is frightened and is choosing not to be. "He is standing in the garden," Lily said. "He is looking up at my window. He has been there for a long time." Lily's bedroom was on the second floor. Marcus went to the window of Lily's room. He moved carefully, keeping himself to one side so that he could look out at an angle without being visible from below. He looked down into the back garden, which was small and enclosed by a wooden fence and lit only by the faint ambient light from the surrounding neighborhood. The garden was empty. He stood at the window for a long time, scanning every corner. The fence, the small shed in the far corner, the apple tree that leaned slightly to the left at the center of the lawn. Nothing. No one. He turned to say so to Dana, who had followed him with Lily in her arms, and then he stopped. Lily was not looking at the garden. She was looking at the corner of her own bedroom. The corner to the left of the door, where the shadows were deepest. She was looking at it with the focused, patient attention of a child watching something that interested her. Marcus turned to look at the corner. Nothing. Darkness. The familiar geometry of a child's bedroom at night. "Lily," he said gently. "There is nobody there." Lily turned her gaze to him. Her expression remained perfectly calm. "He went away when you came in," she said. "He does not like loud people." Then, with the complete equanimity of a 7-year-old, she asked to go back to bed, and Dana carried her there, and Lily was asleep within minutes. Marcus stood in the center of his daughter's bedroom for a very long time after that, looking at the corner. Part 6. The basement. It was Dana who noticed the sounds coming from the basement. She mentioned it on Wednesday morning, over breakfast, in the calm and deliberate way she had adopted over the past week, for discussions of things that would have seemed completely insane 2 weeks ago. "It sounded like footsteps," she said. "Not loud, just the soft, regular sound of someone walking in a small space. Back and forth, like pacing," Marcus said. Dana looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. "Like pacing," she agreed. Marcus had not removed the kitchen chair from under the handle of the basement door after his second night alone in the house. He had never mentioned it to Dana. She had not asked about it. They had both, by some unspoken mutual agreement, left it there. They went down that morning, together, in daylight. The basement was unfinished, with concrete walls and a poured concrete floor and a single exposed bulb on a pull chain in the center of the ceiling. It smelled of old stone and mineral damp. There was a hot water heater in one corner and a utility sink against the far wall, and nothing else. There was nothing in the basement that should not have been in a basement. But on the concrete floor in the center of the room, directly beneath the light, was a pattern that stopped Marcus in the doorway. A circle, perhaps 4 feet in diameter, scratched into the concrete with something hard and sharp, the scratches fine and numerous, as though they had been made over a very long period of time by someone who had nothing else to do. And inside the circle, scratched into the concrete with the same fine, patient lines, were 3 marks. They were not quite letters and not quite symbols. They were something in between, something that suggested intention and intelligence without quite resolving into meaning. Dana took photographs. Marcus stood in the doorway and looked at the circle and tried to determine how old the scratches were. The concrete appeared undisturbed except at the circle. There was no dust in the scratches, which suggested they were relatively recent, or that someone had recently cleaned them, which was a possibility he found far more disturbing than the alternative. They called Gerald that afternoon. Gerald came. He stood at the top of the basement stairs and looked down at the circle for a long time without descending. Then he said, very quietly, that he thought they should leave the house for a few days. Marcus asked him why. Gerald said that Edmund Farrow, in the months before his death, had become convinced that there was a way to make sure he was never alone. He had become, toward the end, obsessed with the idea. He had spoken of it to the few neighbors who would still speak to him. He had believed that if he could simply get someone to acknowledge his presence, to hear his knock and open the door, the loneliness would end. Gerald paused for a moment. The neighbors who found him, he said, reported that the basement floor had been covered in these markings. Every inch of it. They had the floor refinished before they sold the house. But apparently some of it remained. What are they? Dana asked. The marks. Gerald looked at her. As far as anyone could determine, he said, they were his way of keeping count, of the nights, of the knocks, of the times he had waited for someone to come. Part 7, the night he got in they did not leave. Marcus knew, in the rational and structured part of his mind, that leaving was the correct decision. He knew it the way he knew that a building with a compromised foundation should be evacuated rather than repaired from the inside. But there was another part of him, older and less reasonable, that did not want to be driven out of his own home by something that knocked on his door at 3 in the morning. Dana did not leave because Marcus did not leave, and Dana was not the kind of woman who abandoned her position in a difficult situation. They sent Lily to Dana's mother's house on Thursday morning. That night, Marcus sat in the armchair in the living room with every light in the house on, and his phone on the armrest beside him and Gerald's number already dialed in and waiting. Dana sat on the sofa across from him, wrapped in the throw blanket from their old house, reading a book she had not turned a page of in 40 minutes. At 2:58, they both looked up from what they were not doing and looked at each other. At 3 a.m., the knocking came. 3 knocks, slow, measured, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. Marcus stood up. He walked to the front door. Dana was behind him. He looked through the frosted glass and saw the porch and the path and the streetlight and the dark windows across the road. He put his hand on the deadbolt. Dana said his name very quietly once. He turned the deadbolt. He put his hand on the door handle. He opened the door. The porch was empty. The cold night air came in. Marcus stood in the open doorway and looked at the empty porch and the empty path and the empty street. And the silence that followed the knocking was absolute and total, more absolute and total than any silence he had ever heard in his life. A silence that seemed to fill not just the space outside but the space inside as well, pressing into the house through the open door, displacing the warm air and the light and everything familiar. He said, into the empty porch and the empty night beyond it, I hear you. His voice came out steadier than he expected. He said, I hear you. I am here. You are not alone. The silence continued for 3 seconds, and then the temperature on the porch dropped so sharply and so suddenly that his exhaled breath appeared as a white cloud in the air before him, despite the fact that it had been a mild October evening. And then, very slowly, the door to his right, the door that led to the coat closet in the front hallway, swung open on its own. Marcus stood perfectly still. The coat closet was full of coats. Their coats, the winter jackets and rain slickers and the long wool coat that Dana had owned since before they were married. They hung from the rail in the usual way, undisturbed, except that one of the coats, Dana's long wool coat, was swaying gently, as though someone had just passed very close to it, or through it. Marcus stepped back inside and closed the front door and locked every lock. He and Dana stood in the hallway and looked at the coat closet door, which was now still, and at Dana's coat, which was now still. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then Dana said, very quietly, "He came in." "Yes," Marcus said. Dana pulled the throw blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What do we do now?" she asked. Marcus looked at the closet door. "I do not know," he said honestly. Part 8. Learning to live with it, they brought Lily home on Saturday. They had decided, in the particular way that people decide things that they know are irrational, but that feel, nevertheless, like the only possible decision, to stay. They had talked about it for 2 full days, sitting across from each other at the kitchen table with their coffee going cold between them, going over every argument in both directions. The rational arguments for leaving were numerous and persuasive. They could sell the house. They could take the loss and move somewhere without a history. They could remove themselves and their daughter from a situation that was, by any objective measure, deeply wrong. But there was something else, something that Marcus had difficulty articulating even to himself, and that Dana, when he tried, had finished in a sentence. "He is not trying to hurt us," she said. "He is trying not to be alone." Marcus had thought about the circle scratched into the basement floor. He had thought about Gerald's description of Edmund Farrow, a sick and solitary man spending the last months of his life in an empty house on Fenwick Road, waiting for someone to come. He had thought about 3 knocks on a door, repeated night after night, patient and unhurried, the knock of a man who has nowhere else to be and nothing else to do but wait. He had thought about what it must feel like to knock for years and years and years and have no one ever answer. They stayed. The first thing Marcus did was go down to the basement alone and stand in the center of the room beside the scratched circle and say, aloud, that he had heard the knocking and that he had opened the door and that Edmund Farrow was not alone in this house. He said it in the calm, clear voice he used for things he meant seriously. He felt extremely foolish doing it. He did it anyway. The footsteps in the basement stopped that night and did not return. The knocking at 3 a.m. continued for several more weeks, then gradually became less frequent. By December, it came only once or twice a week. By February, it was occasional. By spring, there were entire weeks of silence. Lily, when she returned, had asked, in the matter-of-fact way of young children approaching the supernatural, whether the man was still in the corner of her room. Marcus had told her honestly that he thought the man might be in the whole house, but that he was not harmful and that she should not be frightened of him. Lily had considered this for a moment, and then asked whether the man liked rabbits, because she was thinking about introducing him to hers. Marcus had looked at his daughter and felt something that was not quite terror and not quite love, but existed in the complicated territory between the two. He told her that he thought the man had been alone for a very long time, and that he would probably like anything she chose to share with him. Epilogue, Fenwick Road. They lived in the house on Fenwick Road for 11 years. The knocking never entirely stopped. There were nights, especially in winter when it returned in full, 3 measured knocks at the stroke of 3, patient as a heartbeat, and Marcus or Dana would get up and go downstairs and stand in the hallway and say into the silence, "We are here. You are not alone," and then they would go back to bed. Lily grew up in the house. She never seemed particularly troubled by what lived there alongside them. She had a matter-of-fact relationship with the uncanny that Marcus suspected was partly the natural resilience of children and partly something peculiar to her own temperament. She left for college at 18, and on her last night at home she stood in the center of her old bedroom and said, addressing the room rather than any person in it, "I am going away, but my parents are staying. You will not be alone." Marcus heard her through the open door of the hallway. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor with his back against the wall and his eyes closed and listened. When they eventually sold the house, 14 years after buying it, Marcus sat in the empty living room for a long time before the final walkthrough. He sat in the armchair they were leaving behind because it was too old and worn to move, and he looked at the walls and the floors and the windows and the particular quality of the late afternoon light coming through the glass, and he thought about Edmund Farrow and about what it is to need someone to know you are there. Then he said, aloud to the empty room, "We are leaving now. The people coming in are good people. Give them time to learn your rhythms and they will hear you too." He sat for another moment in the silence. Then he stood and picked up his coat and walked out, pulling the front door firmly shut behind him, and stood on the porch in the thin October sunlight and looked at the house one final time. He had never been able to decide, in all the years they had lived there, whether what haunted the house on Fenwick Road was frightening or tragic, or something more complicated than either of those words allowed for. He thought perhaps it was all three, in proportions that shifted depending on the night and the quality of the dark, and how alone you yourself happened to feel in the small hours of the morning when the world was very quiet, and the distance between yourself and every other living person felt infinite and uncrossable. He walked to the car where Dana was waiting. She looked at him and asked, without asking, whether he was all right. He told her he was. He told her he thought Edmund Farrow probably was too now. Dana looked at him for a moment in the quiet way she had, the look that meant she was deciding whether to say the thing she was thinking or let it rest. She let it rest. They drove away from Fenwick Road in the late October afternoon, and Marcus did not look back at the house. And the house stood on its quiet street under the amber wash of the streetlight and waited, with the patience of something that has learned through long experience that patience is the only thing that ever works. Somewhere inside it, in the particular darkness of the small hours that would arrive in a few hours' time, 3 knocks would sound on the front door. Slow, measured, deliberate. 1, 2, 3. And whoever lived there now would wake confused and lie in the dark and listen and wonder what they had heard and whether it had been a dream. It had not been a dream. It never had been. End.